contrary to known facts.
It's so nice to have you join us today here at Mainline MUFON. If you'd like to learn more about our upcoming programs in the local area, we meet once a month at the Tredyffrin Public Library. You can go to Mainline MUFON. MUFON stands for the Mutual UFO Network. It's spelled M-U-F-O-N, and Mainline MUFON references that we are here on the main line outside of Philadelphia. We have programs every month, and we have very interesting speakers, and this month we're very honored to have Travis Walton with us. So if you'd like to learn more, please visit our website, Mainline MUFON. Thanks so much, and join us again at additional programs here at Mainline MUFON at Radnor Studio 21. Hi, I'm Jennifer Stein. Welcome to Mainline MUFON Television here at the Public Access Network of the Main Line, Radnor Studio 21. We have a very special guest with us today. His name is Travis Walton, and he is the subject of a new documentary film called Travis, The True Story of Travis Walton. Travis has also written his own book, Fire in the Sky, and he is a experiencer, a very famous experiencer of the UFO phenomenon from 1975.
When I regained consciousness, I was in such pain that it would actually sort of knock me back out again, the pain. I knew something was terribly wrong with my body. I could move, but it was so difficult. But I felt I was probably safe in a hospital, that I was being taken care of. There was some sort of device across my chest. I had a lot of pain in my chest. I could hear the sounds of movement around me, and I just took this to be doctors. Then when I looked in the direction of the movement sounds, I could see blurry forms that I thought were doctors wearing surgical caps and masks. So when I sharpened the focus in my eyes, I could see that was not the case. I was looking into the face of this creature. Then I knew I was in very great danger. And here this face was so close to me, another right behind him. The fear gave me the strength to raise my arm. It pushed the one that was standing close to me back, and he fell into the other one. And I was rolling away from him, and this object across my chest fell off. I got on my feet and staggered back, and I bumped up against a shelf, and there was an array of instruments laying out there. I just glanced, grabbed the biggest thing I could find, and started flailing in their direction to keep them from coming any closer. That moment was the focus of my nightmares for months afterward. They stopped with their hands extended towards me and staring in a way that felt invasive and intrusive, like they were looking inside of me. It was horrible. I came to realize that it had to do with the stare, and the stare was them trying to reassert control, I think. Once it was apparent they weren't going to physically or even telepathically control me, they turned and left the room and went to the right. And so I went in the opposite direction that they had gone. Were they behind me? Were they pursuing me? Or was around this tight curve that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, was I gonna run into something worse? Adding to the panic was this feeling of suffocation, this feeling I was about to pass out from lack of air. I came to a doorway and looked in. I was fearful of the chair in the middle. It was a high-back chair, and I was afraid there could be someone sitting in it. So when I moved to the side and could see that there was no one in it, then I moved towards the chair. And it was then that I realized that the closer I came to the center of the room, the walls, the floor, the ceiling were darkened except for points of light. It was a planetarium kind of a projection. My main concern was open these doors. I assumed that perhaps the buttons that were on the arm of this chair might open the door. That moved the star pattern. I was already unsteady on my feet. I turned and there was a man in the door. He had this glass helmet over his head. I started towards him, babbling questions and trying to tell him about these creatures that were in there. He took me by the arm and was leading me out. We went through what I think was an airlock. You know, this door closed and that door opened and we went out. At this point, the craft we came out of was parked inside of this big hangar-like building, or it might have been part of a larger craft. He led me towards the vertical wall opposite this, through some doors, down a hallway, into a room where there were some other people. They were very similar to him. A similar dress, similar coloring, light-colored hair, light-colored eyes. They're leading me, taking me by the arm and putting me over towards this table. I was in a weakened condition, but I felt their strength. But still, the panic I had at being restrained like that, I was able to jerk one hand free, and they put this mask over my face, and I got my finger under the edge of that trying to pull it away. But before I could pull it away, boom, I was out.
I'll tell our audience a brief intro that Travis is one of the most well-known and probably world-renowned UFO experiencers. He had an incident, which we'll be discussing today, in 1975 with 7 other loggers in the forest. And as a result of this incident, Travis went missing for 5 days. As a result, his story became an international news event because it was both a homicide story and a missing person story, and also a UFO story, which brought a lot of undue, unnecessary attention to his incident and event. The entire story has been capsulated into a book that Travis wrote called Fire in the Sky, and it was also featured in a Paramount Pictures film called called Fire in the Sky, which came out in 1993. Since that time, in 2015, for the 40th anniversary of this incident, a documentary film was made by myself and a co-producer, Bob Terrio. It was called Travis, The True Story of Travis Walton. And that film, over the last 2 years, has continued to play and screen in film festivals around the country, and we're very honored. It's continued to win awards and be accepted in mainstream film festivals, which really we're all quite delighted about. So we're bringing Travis here to the main line to present tonight, and we're going to talk a little bit for our program here about the incident, what exactly happened, and how it's affected your life. So for assuming that the watching audience doesn't know much about your background, would you like to give a short little synopsis of the events that happened that day?
Well, that's a big story. This happened in 1975, that's 42 years ago, and I was 22 at the time. And I was working with a crew of 6 other men in the forest on a tree cutting contract. And when we left for home that evening, as it was starting to get dark, we encountered an unidentified flying object hovering near the road. I got out, went out to get a closer look at it, and was struck by a blast of energy from this craft that threw me through the air with such violence that the crew thought that I had been killed. So when they initially reported this to the sheriff, that they were unable to find their friend and that they think he might have been killed, the suspicions of this being a cover-up, wild story to cover up for a murder, took hold with the lawmen, and was not resolved until the men passed state police lie detector tests. That they had indeed seen me get taken.
So describe for us what it was like for all of you. You were leaving the forest, right? It was the end of a work day. You were driving along, and how did you notice this light in the sky, and what did you think it was originally? Well,
originally it just looked like some glimmers of lights filtering through the trees. What the source of it was beyond, behind a thicket where we couldn't really see it. So it wasn't alarming at first. It was just kind of an idle curiosity that grew as each possible explanation for what the source of that might be just wasn't adding up. It couldn't have been the sunset, that was earlier. It wasn't the moon, we could see that in a different direction. The whole idea of hunters camping, it was too far above where ground level would be. But seeing a gap in the trees ahead where some of the light was shining across the road was where I said, let's get up there and see what that is.
And when your crew boss, Mike Rogers, stopped the truck, everybody could see this craft, right, hovering?
Yeah, there it was, and it was so distinct. There was no doubt about what we were looking at.
It wasn't the moon.
The skeptics were trying to say this might be the planet Jupiter. This was no tiny dot of light off in the sky. This was a clearly defined metallic object glowing, hovering there, less than 100 feet away. It was just unmistakable.
One of the boys, when I interviewed him, said he envisioned it was sort of like seeing a Corvette or something he would never get that close to. It was a very sophisticated piece of equipment, and you could sort of see it undulating a little bit or wobbling a little bit.
Well, at one point when I got close, right up close to it, the closer I got, the more alarmed the crew was, and they were yelling at me, get away from there. But at one point, it suddenly got louder and started to move upward. And I just instinctively, reflexively jumped for cover. I got down behind a log, and at that point, I resolved to, like the crew were urging me, to get out of there as quick as I could. So when I stood up to run back is when this blast of energy hit me.
Right. I remember speaking with Steve Pierce, one of the youngest members of the crew, and Steve said it looked like a grenade had gone off because you were flown back as if you'd been hit by a car or as if a grenade had gone off. And you landed without any attempt to break your fall, and you were thrown at least 15 feet, maybe 20 feet from their perspective, what they could see. And once you landed, you also were not moving. So the crew, they thought you were dead, correct?
Yeah, some of the crew were even arguing as whether I had hit the ground in one piece. It was so violent. One thing's for sure, they were all certain I was dead. So, you know, in response to anyone who criticizes the crew for being less than heroic, I think, you know, the crew boss's primary responsibility, right at the point he figured someone had already been killed, is the safety of the remaining crew members.
Right, right. That's Mike Rogers, and he was 28 at the time. You were 21, or 22. You were 22 years old at the time.
Yeah, so long ago.
And you two had worked together for a number of years already at that point, right?
Yes, on various contracts for the Forest Service.
And the job you were doing for the Forest Service, we'll explain that. It was called timber stand improvement.
Yeah, yeah.
So describe what that is.
Well, you know, the actual logging of that particular contract, the Turkey Springs contract, had been completed the previous year. And our job was to continue the cleanup that they're required to do in cutting the trees that are damaged or diseased and actually thinning them out, especially in strips that grid off the entire contract along roads and natural openings to make it easier to fight any forest fire that might move through the area.
So when you have a thick forest, you literally cut a whole strip that you could get maybe a fire truck in there,
Yeah.
or it prevents fire from jumping.
And we take all of that cut up material, and that is burned when the ground is covered with snow or if it's after heavy rain, so that all of the burnable material is pre-burned, and it makes a kind of an area that's much easier to fight fire along that line.
Mm-hmm.
And our crew had been summoned by the Forest Service at times in emergencies to go fight fires because, you know, we're already there, we have the equipment, we know how to cut the trees, and so we were, it was only natural because we could move at a moment's notice and go and do that. And that's where the term fire in the sky actually came from, is thinking that this might be one of those forest fires that we had seen on occasion on our way to or from work, because that rim top area there has one of the highest numbers of lightning strikes of any place in the continental United States, second only to the Everglades. So anywhere along that rim road, you're always within sight of a tree that's been hit by lightning.
And I remember one of the fellows even thinking that it looked more like a plane crash possibly, because you could see the light in the canopy of the trees, and maybe a small plane had crashed or caught fire as well.
There's other possibilities about what that fire might be, you know, even deer hunters, because it was deer hunting season, camped up there on the ridge, but it was from higher than where ground level would be, and it just wasn't adding up with any of the more mundane kinds of explanations for what was the source of this glow.
So the crew drives away, fearing for their life. As soon as you're hit, one of the crewmen says, "Let's get the heck out of here." They drove away. They get a few feet there, well, a couple hundred feet through the forest. Now there's no road that you're driving on. This is just right through the forest, through a clearing, up to what's called the rim road, which is kind of like a dirt road. They were going to try to see if they could maybe get help. They saw maybe some cars going by, is that right?
Somehow the false security of having deer rifles with them, but
Because you didn't have any guns with you. Right?
Yeah, even at that point, they felt the need, the necessity to go back and make sure that I couldn't be helped in some way.
Right. So they turned the truck around and they headed back towards where you were, where they assumed you were, towards that, what's called a slash pile. It's the logs that were ready to be burned in the winter. And as they were heading back down, I believe with Steve Pierce, it says in the film, they all saw this UFO take off.
Yeah.
They were suddenly either eye level with it or maybe even slightly above it.
And so after that, Ken Peterson said his greatest fear was what my body was going to look like. Was it going to be all charred, or even as they'd argued, maybe not even in one piece?
Right, so they drive the truck back and sort of try to park it where the lights are heading up in the little hill that you had run up, looking for you. They had one flashlight between them. Describe what took place there when the boys came back to try to rescue you.
Well, what they told me was that they stayed together. They were pretty closely huddled together. There had even been some fear about returning, to the point where it was offered to the crew members who didn't want to go back to wait out there away from the site. But nobody volunteered to stand alone in the dark. They opted to stay in the truck with the rest of the crew. And so they said they moved in a huddle and called and looked for sign, and they were all trying to stay around close to the one flashlight that they had, and again, probably a false security. But at one point, the guys told me that Mike actually, out of character for him, slipped from his role as strong leader of the group. He actually broke down and started crying because of the enormity of what had happened, and I think, some regret that he had taken off like that. It wasn't even his idea. The crew were screaming at him to go, 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 the minute I was hit.
Well, it was logical because they were thinking maybe they were next. If this craft had hit you with a beam, maybe it was going to hit them with a beam.
I find no fault with them. As a matter of fact, I would say those guys were extremely courageous to come back that night at all. Some of them had voted to go and get the help first, but they actually did go back, and that took guts.
And not only did they go back within 15 minutes, but 3 of the crew members, I believe, returned an hour and a half or 2 hours later.
With the sheriff
With
and
the
his man.
sheriff.
Yeah.
So when they can't find you, they decide they have to go get help. They have to call the police. Describe what Kenny Peterson says happened in that ride back to town. It was about an hour's drive from where you, from the closest town, which was Heber.
Well, the deputy that did arrive there first remarked that several of the men seemed to still be crying, but I think, contrary to what the impression you might get is that Mike was actually too upset to make the call. So it was Ken Peterson who called the local deputy, who called the sheriff and his second in command, and they all, at least I think that there was a maximum of 3 at that point, came back and went back to the site with half of the crew, the other half returning to town to explain to the home crew that, the reason for
Travis is missing.
not just Travis, but the rest of the crewmen who were still with the sheriff.
Right.
So.
Right. So they searched for another hour and a half, 2 hours that night, couldn't find you. And then a massive search ensued at about 5, 6 a.m. that following morning and lasted for several days, for 4 or 5
Yeah, they
days.
had, of course, you know, the entire sheriff's, actual sheriff's department. They had the sheriff's auxiliary, which is kind of like a search and rescue team. A lot of Forest Service people who were familiar with the area. They had quite a few volunteers. There was over 50 people, some on horseback. And as the days went on, the number of searchers increased. They brought in aircraft, airplanes, and helicopters, and even brought in the tracking dogs from the local prison.
Wow. Wow.
Now, the dogs were unable to find any trail beyond what led from the truck up to the middle of the clearing where my body fell.
Wow. Wow. There was just no trace of you. Yeah. Well, obviously, this is what added to the drama of your story, because so many people were looking for you. It came out in the press. This threw a real curveball at your family. Sort of describe what was happening at home, how the phone was ringing off the hook, and various groups, UFO groups, and things were calling your family?
Initially, my oldest brother, a Vietnam War veteran, was suspicious that the crew had murdered me and got very physically threatening with the crew to fess up what they'd done to me. But my second oldest brother, to whom I was more familiar and closer, he was the one who picked me up, and he could see the incredible trauma on me when he found me there in the phone booth. And so, of course, long before I was returned, this was worldwide news, and crank calls were coming in from every corner of the globe, and media bombardment. It was really hectic. There were people, you know, coming from far away into town, not just journalists, but just sightseers, curiosity seekers. It was a madhouse.
So one of the next very important part of your story is what exactly you remembered and what your experience was once you woke up. So we're going to pick up the story from that point where you begin to come to consciousness and you don't know where you are. You have some memory of what happened to you and you think you're in a hospital. So let's describe for our viewing audience exactly what that was like for you and what you remember. I know this is probably about a 10-minute period of time or maybe a 30-minute period of time. It's not real clear.
Well, you know, I was pretty hazy when I regained consciousness, so to speak. It was really kind of partial consciousness, and the incredible pain I was feeling, and the feeling of suffocation, shortness of breath was so intense.
And was the pain focused?
You know, the pain was focused in my head and chest area, so I looked, because I felt something across my chest, to look at what's the source of this pain, and there was some kind of an instrument on top of me, and gradually recalling approaching that object and seeing that being on some kind of a raised surface, looking up, that there was some sort of light above me. I thought I was on an operating table or a gurney of some kind, and assumed I was in a hospital. I could hear the sounds of movement around me, and thinking that everything was okay, the doctors were going to fix this. You know, I felt mortally wounded. It was extremely frightful feeling to be so short of breath and such pain. And I associated those sensations with being where I was.
And you had memory when you were starting to wake up of what had happened to you, right? I mean, you knew you had...
That I had approached the object. I thought perhaps just in running away, because that's what my last thought is to run back to the truck, that somehow I had injured myself, fallen or ran into a tree or something.
And then your eyes slowly began to be able to focus first on this device, which seemed to be like a semicircle or a curved device with light emanating out of it, lying on your chest. Your shirt was pushed up, and your eyes began to be able to focus on that, and then focus on what was around you. Let's describe what you began to see.
Well, as my vision cleared, I could see this light fixture above me, and the sounds of movement. I felt, the best thing was not to aggravate the situation. That movement hurt, and it was hard to move. So I tried not to move at first, but then looking in the direction of the movement, the sound of movement, I saw these creatures standing so close to me. It was such a shock at that point. Boom, it instantly clicked. I was not in a hospital, that I was on board that craft. And it was instant panic, total over-the-top panic. I mean, it was threshold panic to start with because of that feeling of suffocation. But then seeing them so close, and then when I tried to get away, having difficulty making my body move. It was just felt so weak and like I could hardly control it, that, when I tried to lash out at the one that was standing close to me, it was much softer and lighter in weight. It fell back easier than I expected.
So you actually hit this being.
I attempted to hit, but I was so weak I could barely move my arm, and that was scary. That you can't move when you need to move, and it's an emergency. So when I rolled in the opposite direction, this device they had on me fell off, but I was more riveted on them at that point. I just kept my eyes focused on their faces.
So you rolled off the table and stood up next to this gurney, and they're on the opposite side looking at you.
Non-human faces, these huge eyes that just seemed to bore right into me in a most disturbing sort of feeling. And I started screaming and flailing at them. I grabbed up an object from off of a row of
Medical
tools
devices?
or medical equipment or something there. And I was flailing in the air before they got anywhere near close enough to actually strike. But I was trying to threaten and keep them away from me. And they stopped out of reach, out of range. And the stare was excruciating. The three of them all looking into me like they could see right into me. And it gave me this really disturbing feeling inside, a squirmy feeling in my head.
Almost like they were trying to get inside your head.
That's the way
mentally.
it felt, and later it wasn't just fear at the sight of their gaze. It was actually, I think, they were trying to combine forces, some sort of telepathic thing to subdue me, and it wasn't working.
And they were holding up
And
their
I'm
hands.
thinking the reason it wasn't working, not that I have any special resistance, but being struck by this blast of energy, I think probably disrupted the neural circuits in a way that they couldn't navigate at that time. And what supports that is the anomalous characteristics that were discovered in the electroencephalograph that I was given at a very prestigious brain injury hospital.
Yeah, Burroughs Neurological.
Yeah, Barrows
Institute.
Neurological in Phoenix, Arizona. That's where Muhammad Ali went and paid for a whole new wing on the hospital. But the technician was not aware of who I was. I was put in there under assumed name because my doctor knew that that would create way too much attention. The media, it was just crazy. And plus, it had the added benefit of adding what they call a double blind. The technician, being unaware that it was me and in connection with this incident, just looking for signs of injury, would be totally unbiased with no expectation. So when he did find these anomalous brainwave patterns, that supports my theory that perhaps that there were lingering effects from being struck by that energy.
So these beings decide that they don't have any control over you, and they leave the room you're in.
Yeah, at that point, once they're incapable of subduing me telepathically, at that point, even as weakened as I was, I'm a serious threat to them. They're very, very small.
And you were much taller.
Yeah.
So they leave the room, and what happens next? You follow them out, right?
Yeah, well, in a way. That was the only door that I could see to escape from this room. But when they went to the right, I went to the left. And I was just trying to find a way out, just a blind panic to just open a door and what I thought just drop to the ground. This would still be in the forest. Unlikely that was the case at that point in time, but that was my confused thinking. It was just clouded by fear and panic.
And pain.
And
right?
pain.
And pain and
pain.
inability to breathe.
Yeah, inability to breathe. It was very dimly lit, very claustrophobic in there. I couldn't see very far behind me to see if they were pursuing me, and I couldn't see very far ahead of me. This very tight, claustrophobic, dimly lit passageway. You know, I couldn't see far enough ahead of me to see if I was running into something worse.
And it was a curved hallway.
Yes,
right?
it was curved. And so when I found an open doorway out of the hallway leading into a room that appeared to have doorways out of it, I seized upon the idea that opening one of those doors might be an escape from this craft. In piecing the floor plan together later, I can see that none of those doors could have led to the outside. It was too close to the inner portion of the craft. But that's what I was trying to do. And the only buttons available, because there weren't any on the door, no doorknob, no buttons to open them. And I couldn't see light or feel air coming through the crack. So there were some controls on a chair there, and I thought maybe I could open the doors with those buttons. And the controls didn't really seem to do anything. Nothing seemed to respond pretty much, but there was one lever that moved this star pattern.
So you were almost sort of, as you approached this chair, the room changed from being a room to like a planetarium.
Yeah.
But it was not only a planetarium above you, but it was around you and also below you?
Yeah, so whether this was an automatic thing that would come on if someone was located near the center,
Like
or
maybe
if,
the room was weight sensitive as a being got
or
close?
if you could only see it from that point in the room, but it seemed to be normally lit and you couldn't really see any star pattern until you got close to the center.
chair.
And personally, I can't see any reason why you would need to navigate a ship and see the stars, because you would think that would be done, I don't know, digitally through some sort of computations or something other than just a visual feedback. That might actually just have been a sort of a side effect, a coincidence, a feature that is simply for navigating in close quarters when they want to move this inside of a larger ship or inside of a hangar or something of that nature.
So you were pressing these buttons, the star patterns were moving, that kind of made you a little bit sick, I can imagine, the dizziness you may have felt. And you noticed something, right? You turn around back at the doorway you had walked through and tell us what was standing there.
There was what I immediately assumed, and it was an assumption, was a human being, was a man, possibly military, Air Force, something, NASA. In my thinking, who was there to rescue me from these monsters who had taken me, quote, captive. That's not my analysis of the situation currently, but at that time, that's what I was thinking, that this was just someone there to take me out of there.
Looked very human.
Yeah, very human, to save me from these people. And so I had a lot of questions. I was just babbling, in my hysteria, all kinds of questions. I wasn't particularly alarmed at first when I didn't get a response, because I thought the helmet he was wearing, he had a clear helmet, may have been preventing him from hearing clearly what I was saying or being able to speak with it on, whatever. Even in that disorganized thinking, was probably a little disquieting. Why does he need a helmet? I don't have one, So when he took me out of there, I was only too happy to go. We went through what I assumed was some kind of an airlock, a little short passageway where the doors were closed on both sides, just for an instant. But when we came out of that, we were at the top of a landing of a ramp, and it was so much cooler and fresher and easier to breathe out there, and very much brighter. It was so much brighter that I didn't realize how dimly lit the interior was, because I'd just regained consciousness in that level of light, and although it seemed dim to me, I didn't realize how dim it was until I came out, and it was so bright that it hurt. And it was like sunlight. The roof and one wall were kind of a curved surface that was all one surface. And the light that was being given off was like sunlight in color and brightness. So it was either translucent panels that were allowing natural sunlight through, or some sort of artificial, fixture that would put off natural light.
But it was like a curved ceiling, like sort of like an airport hangar of some
Yeah,
sort, like an airplane
it
hangar.
had a hangar. So whether this was part of a larger craft or was a hangar or building somewhere, I don't know. But my main attention was, where is this guy taking me? He seemed to be moving me along much faster than I felt comfortable
Dragging
with.
you along with his arm, right?
I was, half stumbling. I still felt weak and unsteady, and so I was mainly concerned with where he was taking me.
So you walk down this very steep ramp onto a ground level, and you turn around and you look at the craft that you just came out of.
Yeah.
Tell us, was it the same craft you saw in the forest?
It was configured like the one in the forest. It might have been a larger version of the same thing, but it was definitely the same shape. And there was some other craft in there that were more rounded and more polished looking, more silvery. But I wasn't, spending much time studying the interior of this building. I was very concerned with where they were taking me. I still felt mortally wounded, very seriously something wrong inside. So when we went through these doors, down a hallway, he left me with some other people, and they looked human too. And this was very reassuring, especially since they weren't wearing the helmet over their head.
So it was two men and one woman?
Yes, 2 men and a woman in there.
And it was almost maybe like a medical facility or something, right?
Well, there was a table there. They were trying to get me on this table. And these people not wearing helmets, I felt renewed hope that I could get some answers. And so I started screaming all these questions. I was totally out of control, I'll admit, and there's a lot of people who think, oh, I wouldn't be that fearful. I would just stay calm, but you'd have to be there. Anyway. When they wouldn't answer me and they started to take me over to this table and want me to lay down on it, I started to resist. Now, why should I cooperate when they won't even tell me where I am, what's happening to me? I'd like some words of reassurance, maybe. So I was resisting, but I was still in a very weakened condition. I was outnumbered, and they felt very strong. And they got me on the table fairly easy. But in spite of that, I'm pretty strong, and I was able to get one hand free long enough to try to pull this mask away. They put this mask over my face, and I got my finger under the edge of it, and before I could actually pull it completely away, I blacked out. I think there was some sort of a gas in there that was there for that purpose.
And that's the last you remember of this on board a craft, meeting probably 2 different species of beings that apparently were maybe working in tandem together, or we often refer to these short beings with the large eyes as little greys, and the taller beings are often referred to, maybe because of a lack of real knowledge of who they are, they're often referred to as the Nordics. So you had these 2 different species potentially sharing some kind of ship hangar with different types of craft and working in tandem to try to help deal with your situation.
Initially, I viewed this as an intervention by human-looking people, or maybe actually humans, to take me away from these monstrous captors. But in hindsight, I'm thinking that it's possible that these smaller beings had already effected quite a bit of a revival, a resuscitation.
Because that's where you woke up.
I woke up and my heart's still beating, and that may have not been the case when I hit the ground. So it may be that they needed better help from some creature, some being with a more similar anatomy or to my own, or equipment that was suitable for that type of body for whatever reason. I really think now that was kind of a medical rescue.
It sounds like it. It really does. So you black out when this mask is put over your face, and the next thing you remember, you're coming to consciousness, you're waking up again, and you're on the side of a highway. Half your body's on the highway in the gravel, half is on the road, and there's a light around you. Let's pick the story up from there.
Well, I looked to see where this light was coming from. I did not hear a sound. Like the craft in the woods had a bizarre sound, a really wide range of frequencies, from very high to very low, pulsing, alternating frequencies. But this was silent. When I looked to see where the light was coming from, right as I looked, the light went off. So I don't know whether it was like a hatch closing or maybe a switch was turned off, a light switch that was illuminating the area deliberately turned off. But for whatever reason, the light was off, and I saw the bottom of this rounded, smooth, silvery hull there for just a second before it shot up into the sky.
In fact, it was so reflective, you said you could even see the yellow line in the middle of the road
Yeah.
reflected on the bottom of the craft.
I could see the, you know, and because my instinctive reaction was to look for the source of the light, seeing that light was the first, you know, hint that I had that I was on a road. And even though it was night, it was still very refreshing. I mean, the feeling of freedom came with the idea that I'm in familiar surroundings. You know, a road and the forest. You know, I'm comfortable in the forest. So, you know, there was a tremendous amount of relief. And I was, uppermost in my mind was that level of fear that I had been experiencing when I regained consciousness. So looking around and recognizing this stretch of road and the lights of Heber down below, I just ran in that direction.
Now this town, the town of Heber, is the sort of only town, or the nearest town, I should say, towards the dirt road that you guys would take every day when you went to work. You
Yes.
would pull in through the town of Heber, turn on a side road, get on some dirt roads, and then start to switch back your way up to the top of the Mogollon Rim where you were working.
Yeah, so, you know, we would pass through that town every morning on the way to work, and
that is
on the way
actually,
home.
that's actually the town where the boys made a telephone call to the police.
Yes,
It's
and
the
where
closest,
they met with the sheriff's men there in front of the service station that was closed for the night.
So if these beings had actually returned you to the same spot, how far was that from the town?
That would have been 15 miles away with no habitation anywhere near. So, you know, I probably would have frozen to death had they taken me back to where I was taken from.
Right, because this was November 5th,
Yeah,
1975.
it was like 8 degrees at night. It was extremely cold at, you know, 7,000 feet and above.
Right. And to walk that distance, you weren't really in the condition to walk.
Yeah.
Tell us what you were, so you walked down this stretch of road that was sort of curving downhill into town, and you looked for some lights. Tell us what happened.
Well, the first building had pretty bright lights on, and there was smoke or steam coming out of chimneys, and so I went directly to that first well-lit building and started pounding and yelling. Quite a bit of panic in my voice, probably. Nobody came. Now, whether someone heard me and was alarmed that somebody sounded crazy in the middle of the night, or there was nobody woke up or wasn't home, or what.
Or they decided, I'm not going to open the door.
No, not under these circumstances. So for whatever reason, I just figured I wasn't going to get any help there and continued on down farther into town. There was a service station farther up with some lights, and there was a row of telephone booths there. And that's you know, what I, you know, in recalling our trips to Heber on our way to work, knew there was a phone and I could get help.
So in 1975, even without money in your pocket, you could pick up a phone and get a dial tone, correct?
Yeah, and normally if the phone's working properly, you could just pick up the phone, dial 0, and the operator would say, "Can I help you?" And you would tell them what you need. So the first phone booth I went into, the one on the end, was out of order, and that was very alarming. I was at the end of my rope. That burst of energy that I used to run down into town, I was feeling pretty weak at that point. So it was very disheartening for that phone not to work. But I went into the middle one, and it worked. And the operator put me in touch with my brother-in-law, who at first thought, "Oh, this is another one of these prank calls we've been getting all week." I didn't know how long it had been. To me, I thought it was still the same night. But he you know, sarcastically said, "I think you got the wrong number." You know, obviously he thought this was a prank. And I said, "No, it's me. And at that point, he could see from the seriousness of my tone that it really was me. And he said, "Okay, I'll get your brother and come and get you." And I, at that point, thought, my brother, you know, he doesn't even live here. But I must have collapsed. You know, it seemed like, you know, as soon as I hung up, if I did, slumped down in the phone booth. That's where the first thing I knew was the lights were shining in through the glass doors.
Of the headlights of the truck.
The headlights of the truck. And my brother came, lifted me out of there, and put me in the truck. And I was so racked with sobbing and difficulty trying to tell him what I'd been through. I couldn't hardly finish the sentence, but he said something about our mother's reaction in the preceding days, and I thought, well, what? You know? Because I was assuming that this was the same night, and so he said, Travis, feel your face. And I felt that I had a 5-day growth of beard, and then I looked at my watch and I saw the date had changed, and that was kind of like the last straw. I couldn't muster. He said, don't try to talk anymore, too. And so I just kind of went catatonic, and he took me back to town. I had a reunion with my mother, reassured that I was alive. But the concern was to get me some medical checkup real quick. But the madhouse that existed in the Snowflake area, and sort of an antagonism with law enforcement, the trust was, not real high between them, because there had been some crank calls, warning about, other cases that had happened where when the people involved were turned over to authorities that they had disappeared or something. So.
Or they weren't necessarily treated very well.
Or weren't treated well. So, I was in no condition to be, interrogated.
Right. And the crew and even your brother were, the police assumed that there was a murder that had gone on, so the crew members had been singled out during the couple days of searching and accused of murdering you, and they were encouraged to come forward and say, tell us what happened, and then maybe you'll have a lighter sentence. You might, if you come clean and tell us what everyone else did, we'll work with you. So there was a lot of distrust going on. No one seemed to want to believe the boys as to what they actually saw.
So my brother's number one priority was to get me some medical examination. He was pretty thorough, He actually made sure to collect the clothing I'd been wearing and put it in a sterile container, collect the first urine sample, actually weighed me on the scale and found that I'd lost a considerable amount of weight. And those scales were brought with us so that when they were compared with the doctor's scales, we could see that they were accurate in comparison to those. And that in that short period of time, because of the great amount of thirst, that most of that weight had been recovered. So it was surmised that there had been some dehydration. Whether this is an artifact of some treatment that I had undergone, or miscalculation on human requirements or something, I don't know. But,
or just not drinking for 5 days.
Yeah, just because you have to be conscious to drink.
Right.
So.
Right.
The medical examinations were pretty thorough. There was, blood and urine tests. There were upper body X-rays, EKG, EEG, brainwave scan, a very thorough physical exam of every inch of my body by the doctor. The doctor found what he described as a 2-millimeter red spot on the inside of my right arm. However, in his report, he described it as partially healed and not over any major blood vessel. Nevertheless, the debunkers who tried to explain this all away tried to claim that this was the site of someone who would be injecting hallucinogenic drugs, which would simply make them think they had seen aliens. But that's a foolish notion. Nobody injects hallucinogens, and that doesn't explain how 6 other men shared my hallucination, supposed hallucination.
So this whole journey for you happened at a rather tender age. You were 21 years old.
22.
22 years old. You had been going to college and working. it dramatically changed the course of your life and the course of the other men as well who worked on this logging crew. Let's talk a little bit about how you decided to write a book. I believe it was you and also the other crew contributed a little bit. Mike Rogers contributed his memories. Dwayne Smith, one of the other crew members, had done a drawing.
Well, I had no idea about writing Fire in the Sky at first. I wanted to be left alone.
Right.
I hid out from the media, and ironically, that prompted them to remark that his reluctance to speak to the media cast doubt on his story. But as soon as I began doing interviews, they said, he's a publicity seeker. So, you know, damned if I do and damned if I don't. You know, one way or the other, they are trying to interpret it as being indicative that there was something wrong with my story. But
it was maybe 15 years after this event that
yeah,
you finally
you know,
had the courage
I
to write
ignored
this
a lot of these attacks because they were just, you know, I was totally inexperienced with this sort of thing. But these media things, these debunkers, these professional skeptics, they sell books on this subject, and they would just make up stuff that could be easily disproved if the reporters had been slightly more diligent. You know, like to even ask the question, if his hallucination was drug-based, how come 6 other men saw what he had?
And if it was an hallucination, what was the Navajo Search and Rescue doing with 50 men and dog hunters out there? And what also happened is a professional lie detection brought in by the police.
And
This
also, the blood and urine samples taken by the doctor were put through the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's drug screen, proved no trace of any drug in my body. So there's medical proof right there. But, you know, when people are eager, give me something to hang my disbelief on, it can be pretty flimsy, and they'll go for it.
Yes, unfortunately, we debunkers or people who want to cast doubt on a situation only need to cast doubt on people's acceptance of some facts, and then suddenly it's not considered a credible story, whether there's any fact-checking done at all.
Oh yeah, and you know, the similar theory that the hypnotist had planted these memories in my mind doesn't hold up when that hypnotist had not regressed the other crew members who also remembered what I remembered. So every theory had gigantic holes in it, but anything that they could throw out there, you know, dig into your past, find out your 5th grade teacher reprimanded you for something, you know, any negative information about any individual involved was used to just basically a smear campaign. And so that drove me to document piece by piece every single theory that the debunkers offered and just blow them out of the water because there was no support for it. There was a theory that this had something to do with the logging contract, but affidavits signed by the Forest Service contracting officers themselves said there's absolutely nothing in any of these proceedings that would support any kind of a theory that had anything to do with the logging contract.
Let's talk a little bit about the lie detection that was done. The head investigator was Marlon Gillespie. He was the chief investigator from the police department, called the Arizona State polygraph expert at the time, named Cy Gilson, who was brought in to provide polygraph for the 6 other men on the crew. And this was the Sunday before you were returned, because you were still missing. These men were really accused of murder. They could have actually been held in jail under suspicion. And in order to clear the suspicion that was against them, they agreed to take lie detection.
Oh, they volunteered to take any test. Give us sodium pentothal, they said. But, you know, the state police, Cy Gilson, the polygraph examiner, was an officer in the Department of Public Safety, which is the Arizona State Police. And the testing was quite thorough. Eventually,
it took all day, correct?
Yeah, and not all of the testing was completed at that point. Alan Dallas was uncooperative, but he later took tests. And every one of the crew, including myself, passed tests from the state police polygraph examiner.
And your test was several weeks later after
Yeah.
you were returned.
But the bottom line being that even with 6 past tests, The president of the American Polygraph Association at that time said, no one test is 100%, but when you have 6 tests passing on the same issue, the odds would be over 1,000,000 to 1 of there being any kind of mistake. And that was with 6 tests. As of now, there's been 16 past tests. I have passed 5 different tests from 3 different examiners, all of whom had years of law enforcement experience, the top of the game. And those tests were reviewed by the authors of the textbooks in polygraph. So the official educated opinion on the polygraph evidence is unanimous in support that we were telling the truth.
So this story remains as one of the classic stories. There's a number of very profound UFO stories. The Allagash story that happened in Maine. There's a number of them that involved a number of people, like your story has. But your story was finally captured in a Paramount Picture film called Fire in the Sky, directed by Tracy Torme.
Well, he was the screenwriter.
He was a screenwriter. So you were working on a book at the time, and that manuscript was slightly interpreted or slightly used as an outline?
Well, Hollywood always gets creative with real-life stories, so there were some departures from what actually happened, much to my disappointment, and those of many others. However, the net effect in the end run was I was glad that the film was made. It got a much wider audience to take a serious look at the facts, a deeper look, and the documentation, which is copious. Huge amounts of documentation for every aspect of what happened there.
Having read the book and used the book as an outline for the film, I consider it an excellent read for anyone seriously interested in the topic. From that, the movie was released in 1993, and now it's been 40 years, and Bob Terrio and myself have been able to recapture a overview of the entire story with a 40-year perspective, re-interviewing you and the living members of the crew. We also interviewed Cy Gilson and Marlon Gillespie and Deputy Ellison, who was the first on the scene, and a number of other people involved in your case, as well as a lot of UFO experts. Have you been happy with the results that the documentary has gotten?
Oh, absolutely. It was high time that someone did a thorough and precise job of recording the facts of the matter, actual interviews with the people involved, and some of the best investigators in the field who had spent years looking into this. It's really an exceptional piece of work, and it's got some pretty decent reenactments that are certainly much truer to what actually happened than Paramount's movie.
We are hoping that eventually the film will make it to mainstream network television, Netflix, and things like that. So that's coming up in the future, we hope. We also are going to be having you back in the Philadelphia area in October with MUFON Pennsylvania. You'll be coming in to speak there, both in the Bucks County Conference in 2017 and also in the Pittsburgh Conference. So it'll be a very special year this year. And you'll be back in the Philadelphia area to host a screening of the film, which is really very special. We're looking forward to that on October 29th.
Yeah, well, once I found out that running from the media was not going to help and was misinterpreted as, having something to hide, and then finding out in addition that if I didn't get out there and rebut these things that the debunkers were throwing out there, just garbage, easily refuted things, if you just point people to their facts and documentation, sources that they can verify for themselves. And so it's became kind of a mission to sort of redeem myself and correct a lot of misconceptions, but also to try to educate the public, to make people aware that this is that there's a reality here that's important for people to be aware of.
Now, what we are discovering with the Hubble telescope that's out there, and lots of mainstream physicists acknowledging that there are numerous Earth-like planets, it's quite feasible that there may be life out there. We are now at the point where we're considering making a manned mission to Mars in 2023. What's your opinion about the potential possibility of life in the greater universe?
Well, at the time this happened, the skeptics were fond of quoting astronomical facts as indicating that life would be so sparse that it would be so rare they'd never find us, or things of that nature. But what with the Hubble telescope and direct observations, it's been discovered that the numbers that were plugged into this hypothetical equation called the Drake equation, supposed to analyze and estimate the number of possible life-supporting planets in our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, were far too conservative. The numbers are far greater than anyone suspected. Rather than only some stars having planets going around them, NASA said just this last year that virtually every star has about a dozen planets. And inevitably, the ones in the mid-range, not too hot, not too cold, are going to be possibly life-supporting. So they've already counted up hundreds and identified them from here. So the skeptic theory back then that even if there was life out there, they'd never find us is absurd, because with our relatively primitive technology, we know where they are.
Wow. Yeah,
From here. Yeah.
Things have changed,
Yeah,
yes,
things
and
have changed.
they're about to change probably a lot more in the next 20, 30 years. I'm
Yes, so
very excited to see what happens.
we're reaching a tipping point in awareness, and I hope to facilitate that. Make people aware of this to the extent that they'll be ready. It won't be such a shock. It won't be so disruptive for this knowledge to suddenly be confirmed.
Well, you're certainly part of the disclosure movement, Travis, and anyone who gets the chance to meet you and work with you and read your book and hear you speak gets the sense of your own integrity and personal authenticity to your story. And I've been very humbled to have the pleasure to work with you.
Well, you're an important part of disclosure. I think educating the public, preparing them for this, to where it's not such a shock and not so disruptive. You know, there's two schools of thought on disclosure. We demand government public acknowledgement and confirmation today, and other people who feel that it might be wise to break it to them gently.
Yeah, well, I think both are needed. A slow, gradual awareness as you begin to expand your perspective. You know, many people I know within the MUFON organization are involved in the Mutual UFO Network because they've had sightings. And once you have a sighting, and you realize you weren't alone, or you have a sighting with a couple of other people, it can be verified. It's a life-shattering and life-changing experience. I describe it as an analogy, where you have a balloon, you blow it up and you poke a hole in the balloon and it flies all over the room, right? You can't put the air back in the balloon. You can't put your reality back in the same way that it was before.
Well, 40 years ago, it was generally recognized that people who believed that there could be life out there were kooks. But now we're reaching a tipping point. The people who think that we're alone, that's the definition of a kook. Somebody who believes something